that at the end of the talk, there's a pizza lunch, and we want you to talk to the students and the teacher. Okay. Yeah. And typically, we'll be ending. We'll want to end, like a few minutes before noon, something like that. So if you give a 55-minute talk, that's better than a 60-minute talk.
Okay.
Because then I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll try to do it in 50.
Be comfortable.
Okay.
I'm going to cut a little. You're going to lose a few minutes here because people to trickle in a little bit.
Okay.
Sure. You won't be offended.
Okay, sure.
I think people will trickle in, but we don't get started. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Chen Li at Hopkins, Mechanical Engineering from Hopkins. Chen has his PhD from Peking University.
Bachelor's.
In 2005. He worked with Dan Goldman, the formidable Dan Goldman, at and then when did you get your doctorate degree in 2011?
I went 2012.
2012, and then he went to Berkeley. He worked with Bob Fall at Berkeley for a couple years as a postdoc, and then
actually three and a half years.
Okay, in 2015 you went to Hopkins.
Beginning of 2016.
2016. All right, hold it up. So Chen is, he's got a growing string of best paper awards, and he's got many prizes. At Berkeley, he had this impossible to get Miller research fellowship. Because at Berkeley, you have to walk on very, very thin water. The better word. And you also got a Burroughs, right? Yeah, you had a Burroughs.
Yes.
Welcome plan. So he's a highly decorated, very lots and lots of stuff going on in his lab, and lots of decorations on his wall to show it. So, Chen, welcome. We'll be very eager to hear what you tell us.
Thanks, Dan, for the introduction and for inviting me here again. So it's my great pleasure here to give you guys an update of what we have been doing over the last few years in my lab, which we think is the beginning of statistical mechanics of locomotor transitions in complex terrain. Yeah, so we've been talking about having robots help humans in a large variety of applications in our society, and we already see many robots that have worked out really well in the laboratory, and some of them also very well in the real world. One of the most well-known is robotic vacuum, and we are also recently starting to see self-driving cars among many other of these wonderful robots. And the way that robots usually deal with the problem of moving in complex environment is through obstacle avoidance. So here, take, for example, the self-driving car. You use sensors to scan your surrounding to create a geometric map of your environment, and then you can treat any object that's other than the flat surface as obstacles in order to, and you can then plan trajectories to avoid them. In order to reach your goal, you very often have to make transitions between different driving modes, as you see here. For example, here, the self-driving car just stopped to wait for a cyclist, continues to drive forward, and then slowing down to wait for another vehicle to pass by, and then continues to drive, and so on and so forth. There are many applications where we want our robots not just to avoid obstacles, but actually to traverse a lot of them, as you see in these cases here. In such situation, we can also imagine that in order to reach their goal, the robots should also be able to make robust locomotor transitions, actually using physical interaction with the environment and not just trying to avoid them because it's impossible if you avoid obstacles to go through earthquake rubble, for example. And even the best of our robots still currently struggle a lot in these kinds of complex terrain. And that is largely because we don't yet have, as compared to our understanding of obstacle avoidance using geometry, we don't yet have comprehensive understanding of how to make physical interaction to robustly make locomotor transitions. Animals, on the other hand, do amazingly well in almost any terrain, as you see here. And you can clearly see that they don't always avoid obstacles, but make very good of physical interaction to make robust locomotor transitions. So what has been stopping us? When we look at our understanding of locomotion for flying and swimming, we already have a long history, a couple hundred years of the fields of aero and hydrodynamics with many experimental tools, theoretical and computational models that help us understand and make predictions of the fluid structure interaction. Whereas for terrestrial locomotion, our understanding has been relatively, compared to aero and hydrodynamics, relatively limited to simple surfaces such as rigid ground, because that's where we naturally started our investigation. And also it has been relatively limited to near steady state single mode locomotion. We're beginning to look beyond that, but the understanding is still not as comprehensive compared to aero and hydrodynamics field. So when it comes to more challenging environment terrain like desert sand or loose Martian soil, or even forest floor and earthquake rubble like these with many cluttered large obstacles, then the simple models that we developed for flat rigid surface no longer work. So in other words, we need to begin to address this lack of tools and models of interaction with the complex terrain, or create terradynamics to make progress. So that has been what I have been focusing on since I was a student with Dan Goldman at Georgia Tech. So in his lab, I focused on understanding how legged animals and robots move on the surface of sand. Here I had the opportunity to collaborate with Dan Kodacek here, and using their Rex robot, and eventually we came up with basically the equivalent of lift and drag forces in the granular media to help predict locomotion. And since I moved to Berkeley as a postdoc 8 years ago, I began thinking about how we can begin to expand beyond granular environment into these kinds of more complex 3D terrain. And I was, at that time, really greatly inspired by a video from Dan's lab where the Rex robot, which you saw earlier, the Rex robot continued to get stuck and even flip over in such rubble-like terrain. Yeah, so in Bob Fo's lab, I focused on studying this cockroach, which is native to tropical rainforest, because it's able to go through such complex 3D terrain on a daily basis. And a forest floor environment that looks like this, as you can see, is very complex and seems formidable to understand. So as a first step, we picked grass as a simple representative terrain that still has the essential complexity being multiple obstacles cluttered together. And similar to what people do when they study fluid structure interaction, you can have wind tunnel or flow channel to help you control the flow to do repeatable experiments. I made this artificial grass field, which are laser cutting paper assembled into an array to enable repeatable experiments. So here is a video of the cockroach running through these artificial grass. In this case, the animal initially runs and collided and stopped, then pushed through the first couple of layers, climb up the third, and fell forward. So with this, we can observe the video and classify the sequence of locomotor modes through which the animal transitions. And this trial, as you can see, takes the animal about 4 seconds to go through. And here's another behavior. The animal was forced to stop. In trying to push through the beams, it very quickly makes a transition by rolling its body so that its very narrow, thin body can fit through the narrow gaps between the beams to traverse. Yeah, so here are these two trials that you just saw. So now with our apparatus, these controlled artificial grass, we can then do this for many times to map out this complex locomotor transition pathway. You can see that the animal starts and makes use of either one or a sequence of different locomotor modes to traverse. If you look at each trial, it seems random, it seems stochastic. You cannot really predict what the animal will do. But when you have enough data, you can see that statistical trend starts to emerge. For example, there's this one particular mode, rolling, which we just saw, that the animal used the most frequently. So here, the thickness of these arrows are proportional to the probability of the animal using that particular mode. You can see that about 2/3 of the time, the animal would use this roll mode to eventually traverse. And it turns out, when we measure the time that it takes for the animal to do so, when the animal uses the rolling mode only, compared to if it ever uses any other mode, it is significantly faster, which is perhaps indicating that this mode is the easiest. So from this, it seems like the animal most frequently use a mode that is the easiest. Yes.
So are the action mode here considered like active or passive? Yeah, because I feel like the rolling happens because he's trying to squeeze through
Yes.
others, and that happens passively.
Yeah, I'll get into that in just a minute. Yeah, it's very likely a combination of both. Yes. Yeah. So this was one of the major findings from my postdoc work. So since I moved to Hopkins, I've been focusing with my students to try to understand how such probabilistic transition pathways emerge from physical interaction. So with that, I would then, over the next 15 minutes or so, highlight one recent project in which we think we began to understand that using a simplified system. So here, these beams are cantilever beams, and we have 3 layers. In the recent experiments, we simplified our setup with basically rigid beams with torsional springs at the base, which are easier to model, and we can also track the system with all these tags to reconstruct the 3D motion and the physical interaction, as you see on top. So here, and we're only focusing on a specific transition which happens between 2 modes. The first mode is what we now call the pitch mode. It's basically the animal pushing the beams down and run over them to go over. In order for you to do that, the animal body would very often have to, as you push, have to pitch up slightly. So we call that the pitch mode. And here's another trial where the animal eventually rolled, and it would initially very often try to push. So initially trying to do the pitch mode, but very quickly finds this rolling mode to traverse. So here it makes this quick transition from the pitch to the roll mode. Now we repeated again, collected a lot of animal data, and there's a similar observation, which is that the animal most frequently uses this rolling mode to traverse. So here again, the arrows indicate the probability. The animal would very often initially try to push in the pitch mode, but it very rarely push all the way or stuck in that pitch mode, but very quickly transition to this rolling mode. Yeah, so to begin to understand how this emerges from that physical interaction, we created the simplest model we can think of. So here, this model is far from the real system. The real animal has many degrees of freedom, has bodies and appendages that are flexible. And also, the interaction is dynamic. There's friction, there's damping in the beams, etc. There's oscillatory self-propulsion. But as a first step, we ignore all that complexity and only consider the body as a rigid body, the animal as a rigid body, which has to stay in contact with the ground due to the weight pulling on it. And then we consider 2 adjacent beams as rigid plates with torsional springs. So now with this very simple quasi-static model, we can write down the total potential energy of the system, which is the sum of the gravitational energy of both the beam and the body, and the elastic energy of the beams as they bend. So when, depending on where the body is and how it's oriented, it's going to have to deflect the beams in different ways. That's going to, and that also changes the body gravitational energy. So the total potential energy is a function of both the position and the orientation of the body relative to the beams. So here is a model calculation for a specific location when the body is very close to the beams. So the potential energy as a function of the body pitch and the body roll. And you can see there are 3 local minima. There's one here with a finite pitch and zero roll, and that course, if you are right at the locominima, you'll be in that state as shown there. So, and that's understandable because when you are in close proximity, if you don't roll, then if you pitch too much, your gravitational energy goes up too much. If you don't pitch enough, then you bend the beams too much, and that elastic energy goes up. So there's a sweet spot, a locominima, at which the pitch gives you the lowest energy. And then there are these other modes where one to the left, one to the right, where you either roll 90 degrees to the left or to the right. And that has a locominima also quite easily to understand because you don't have to bend the beams at all in that case. Yeah, so from this very simple physical picture, what we think might be happening when the animal makes this transition from the pitch to the rolling mode is that it might initially be stuck in that pitch locominima, and somehow it's able to make the leap from that locominima, pitch locominima basin into the roll locominima basin. And in order for you to make such a transition, you would then have to overcome energy barrier. Also, what I forgot to mention is that the roll locominima shown in red actually has a lower energy than the pitch locominima. So the animal seems to be leaping from a locominima that's higher to one that is lower. Yeah, so we were greatly inspired by another field, and to this I have to really greatly thank my postdoc advisor, Bob Full. When we first, even when I was in his lab, when I first was thinking about these locomotor transitions, he thought that, he suggested that there's this field of protein folding that seems quite analogous to what you're doing. You should look into it, and that, I think, really helped got a lot of what we're currently doing started, so I'm very grateful for his guidance. So there's this field of, people have applied this energy landscape approach in many fields, and the field where people has made the most progress is to understand the probabilistic folding transitions of proteins. So when proteins are initially created inside biological systems, there are long molecules that are unfolded. And if you calculate the total free energy of the system, it has a very high free energy. But the protein would very quickly go through a bunch of transition states to reach a native state, a fully folded state, which is unique for each protein. And when you view that on the free energy landscape, you can see that what happens is it's going to take many different paths probabilistically, go through these intermediate transition states, which are saddle points, to eventually find the global minima. So we see from our observation earlier, there seems to be this strong analogy. So we're wondering, perhaps we can use this energy landscape approach to understand how these probabilistic transitions emerge from the physical interaction here. But there's one caveat. For protein folding, or these microscopic systems, which are near equilibrium, you have thermal fluctuation that turns out to be comparable to the barrier separating these locominima or saddle points that can help your system probabilistically leap between them to find the lowest energy state. Whereas in our case, this is a macroscopic self-driven system, and thermal fluctuation is clearly irrelevant. So could there be something that helps our system do the same? So with that, if you look at how our animals interact with the terrain, because their locomotion is self-propelled, there's always this oscillatory propulsion against the environment. So that actually leads to quite a bit of body fluctuation with body oscillation with kinetic energy fluctuation. So we think perhaps this is analogous to the thermal fluctuation. So we couldn't directly test that in our animals because we can't really control how much their body oscillates when they do this. So we created a robotic system, a very simple system to test this hypothesis, which, as you can see, is basically a physical realization of our model. We have this body suspended with a mechanism so that it's almost free to pitch and roll with very little friction in response to external forces. And we have these plates mounted on torsional springs representing the beams. We can now push the body forward through a linear actuator and then add oscillation. In this case, we simply use a vertical oscillation, but in our preliminary study, we also tried oscillation along other directions of the body, and qualitatively, we find similar trends, so we use this for simplicity. So here is a representative trial of the body interacting with the beams on top without oscillation and below with oscillation, and the body starts right in the middle of the two beams. You can see that without oscillation on top, the body would be stuck in this pitching mode, pushing the beam down when it tries to go forward. Whereas with enough oscillation, kinetic energy fluctuation, it's able to quickly find this rolling mode to go across. And now we can use our experimentally measured 3D motion to reconstruct this potential energy landscape that I defined earlier. So here is a snapshot of the landscape when the body is still far away from the beams. There's no physical interaction. So the body, in this case, is suspended, so it's not in contact with the ground, but we made it bottom heavy so that, very like the animal, just the gravitational force is going to make it stay put without any other forces. So it won't pitch up or roll because it's bottom heavy. So when viewed on a landscape, you can see that if you start, you have a global minima at the origin. If you pitch or if you roll, that would raise the center of gravity. And as your body comes close and starts interacting with the beams, if you look at the video on top, you can see that global minima evolves into the pitch locominima that I defined earlier. Let's look at that again. You can see it evolves into the pitch locominima, and then these two roll locominima starts to emerge, which have a lower energy than the pitch minima. So without oscillation, and that point and the trajectory is the current state and the trajectory of the system projected onto the landscape. You can see that without oscillation, the system is stuck to that pitch locominima. Yes?
Could you quantify what the magnitude of the oscillation is?
Yes, I'll get into that, yes. Yes, so you can see it's stuck, but when you have oscillation, you can see that it very quickly escapes that locominima basin and finds this roll locominima, which have a lower energy. Yeah, so here are just two, so from this, our take home is that a locomotor mode or trajectory of the system state is strongly attracted to a locominima basin. And we did this systematically for a large range of oscillation frequency, each collecting 10 trials, and we plotted the ensemble of the system evolution on the landscape. You can clearly see that as the frequency increases or that kinetic energy fluctuation increase, the system had higher and higher chance of making the transition from the pitch to the roll locominima, which is lower. And this figure on the bottom right shows the measured kinetic energy oscillation fluctuation as a function of oscillation frequency. And that green line is the maximum kinetic energy oscillation that we added, which we will use later. Yeah, so from this, we concluded that each of these events is stochastic, but together, collectively, they occur in a probabilistic way, which is reminiscent of statistical mechanics. And also, kinetic energy fluctuation helps make transition. And next, we were also curious to see the effect of the environment. So we, in this case, changed the stiffness of the beams. So on the left here is the very low stiffness, as if nothing is there. And on the right here is a very high stiffness, almost rigid for the animal. And you can see that, as you would expect, they changed quantitatively changed the landscape. In the low stiffness limit, that landscape just looks like if you have no beams, that global minima, because it's dominated by gravitational energy of the body. And the system is always stuck in that global minima. Whereas when you have high stiffness, you can see that this pitch locominima starts to become higher and higher relative to the roll minima as the stiffness increases. So here, again, inspired by the microscopic system, the system tends to leap from high free energy state to lower and lower free energy state, and this is called a thermodynamic favorability. So we coined, we interpret it as perhaps the rolling mode, depending on the energy of the locominima, the basin that is lower is perhaps more favorable. So we track the locominima energy of the system. On top, this is again a snapshot at a particular position, but as you push the body forward, this landscape is going to evolve. So we track the position of both these locominima and plotted them here in these dashed lines as the body moves forward. So the x coordinate here at the bottom here indicates your progress forward. 0x is where the beams are. So you can see that in the low stiffness limit, the pitch mode actually has a lower, the pitch minima basin is lower than the roll minima basin, because if you roll, you are actually increasing your gravitational energy, and that dominates the energy landscape. So the pitch mode is more favorable in the low stiffness limit, whereas when the stiffness goes up, you can see that the roll mode becomes more and more favorable compared to the pitch mode. And if you look at how the system is making transitions, you can see that out of 3 of these cases, the first one, the third one, and the last one, the system had a higher probability to either stay in the already favorable pitch mode or make the transition to the more favorable rolling mode. From this, we concluded that the transition statistically occur from the less to the more favorable modes. But there's one thing that puzzled us quite a while, which is if you look at this second mode, you can see that as you continue to go forward past the beams, the rolling mode has become more favorable. But if you look at the evolution of the system ensemble on the landscape, it never makes the transition. It always is stuck in that pitch locominima. So this puzzled us for a while. So we were, like as you were asking, we wanted to then look more carefully quantitatively at how this kinetic energy kinetic energy fluctuation compares with the barrier to help us maybe better understand this. So we did that. So we did that. Here is again a snapshot. A snapshot of the landscape for a relatively high stiffness. So in order for you to escape from the pitch locominima, there in this pitch and roll space, there are many ways you can do it. Here we draw a green line indicating you follow a straight trajectory. This is just the imaginary path. If you were to move that way from the pitch to the roll locominima basin, then you would, if you take a cross-section cut of the landscape, which is visualized in the middle here, you would see a profile that looks like this. So you start from the, you can see it, you start from the pitch minima, you have to overcome a barrier there to reach another locominima, which falls within the roll minima basin. And now we can do this for all the imaginary directions in this space. So we do a 360 scan. You can see that green line and this cross-section when it scans across. And then what's shown on the right here is the visualized barrier in different directions if you follow this straight path in this pitch and roll space. So the further you are away from the origin here, the greater that barrier is along that direction. So you can see here, if you try to only pitch up or pitch down, you have to overcome really high barrier to escape that pitch minima. But if you make your way towards the rolling basin, you can see that those barriers are much less. And that green circle here is the maximum kinetic energy oscillation that we measured, which we injected. And you can see it is comparable to that minimum barrier. And this is just one snapshot. Again, we can do this for the entire process as the body moves across the beams. So here's a video visualizing that. You can see that this barrier profile keeps evolving, but generally you still have a low barrier towards the direction of the roll locominima. So what we then did is, for each of these snapshots, we look at, if you move from the pitch locominima in the direction towards the roll locominima, we look at what's the lowest barrier that you encounter. So basically we scan across this sector to find the lowest barrier and plot that as a function of your progress forward, which is shown in the black curve here. So you can see initially when you're far away, you have a high barrier compared to your kinetic energy oscillation. But as you get close, that barrier quickly goes down to be very small, much less than the barrier. And then eventually it goes back up. And this green band here is the mean plus standard deviation of the observed position at which the system makes that transition. So you can see that it correlates really well with where the potential energy barrier is less or at least comparable to the kinetic energy oscillation. Yeah, so with this, we then again looked back at how this varies across different beam stiffness. You can see that for the too high stiffness case, this is true, as I just explained. The transition statistically happens when the barrier is smaller or comparable to the kinetic energy oscillation. For the lowest case, because that pitch minima is already the most favorable one, you have, in order to escape, you have very high barriers, so you can't do that with the available kinetic energy oscillation. Whereas for this case that puzzled us, if you look at it initially before you pass the beams, basically for x less than 0, you can see that at that time both the pitch and the roll mode have about the same energy. So one of them is not more favorable than the other. And you start in the pitch locomotive mode. And at that time, you had this specific position range in which you do have enough kinetic energy to help you make the transition. But that transition is not more favorable, so it doesn't happen. And as you move across the beams after 0, you can see that the roll mode becomes more favorable. But at this time, the barrier has already come back up. You no longer have available enough kinetic energy oscillation fluctuation to help you make that leap. So this, we think, explains why in this particular case it's always stuck in the pitch minima mode. So from all these, we concluded that there's two conditions that you have to satisfy in order for transition to occur. One is that you have to have enough kinetic energy oscillation, a fluctuation comparable to your potential energy, to the lowest potential energy barrier. And also you need that nearby mode to be more favorable than the mode you're currently in to make the transition. So finally, we also did basically the equivalent set of experiments and model analysis for our animals. And animals, as we all know, as the student earlier asked, it's obviously capable of not just passive interaction, but it can do have many active behaviors. So surprisingly, what we found is that it has very similar trends as we observe in the robot system. Despite the fact that it's capable of active behaviors, the physical interaction seems to play a dominant role in these transitions.
Chen,
yes?
How did you scale the mechanical oscillations? Did you use careful scaling from the gate frequencies that the animals are using, or did it not matter?
In this case, we measured from experiment. What do you mean exactly by scaling?
Your mass scale and your springs magnitudes are all different, but presumably you're using some kind of similarity in springs and masses to get the oscillation to match the oscillations.
Oh, I see.
You showed a range of mechanical oscillations, but I could imagine that you might be quite sensitive outside some range. I wonder if the range that you explored has anything to do, is similar in some way to the oscillations that the animals experience as they go through the gates.
I see. You're saying like what we concluded for the robot, does it scale down to the animal?
Yeah. Are you scaling your mechanical oscillations?
Yeah, we haven't considered or explored that carefully. Yeah, but I think that's a great point. And we are starting to think how we can begin to create a predictive theory. So here I'm just highlighting one project. We actually have a couple other systems where we found very similar behavior, and we are thinking perhaps we can begin to have something that's more general, and scaling would certainly be very important to consider there. Yeah, so from all these, we were, when we looked back at compared with microscopic protein folding, initially I only see this as a very loose analogy. I found it just hard to imagine that there will be similar physical principles of these transitions, but when we compared back to the microscopic system, these three principles that we discovered turned out to be almost the same, at least on a high level. So we're hoping, our vision is that perhaps this can be the beginning of analogous to what people did in protein folding and other microscopic system to help us to create a predictive theory that can allow us to predict locomotor transition rates and probability distributions, as people have already done, and that can help us do design and control of the robots. Yeah, so just very quick preliminary results to show a proof of concept of our idea towards that. So in the microscopic system, people can apply Newton's second law by writing down the Langevin equation to think of these systems as going through a diffusion process on the landscape. And we are applying a similar idea here. So if you write down the longitudinal equation for our system, because we observe that the behavior of the system is seems to be strongly governed by this potential energy landscape, that indicates that the conservative forces that are modeled by the potential energy might play a dominant role. So we can calculate the potential energy gradient, use that, and then here we're using, this is not a predictive model yet, we're using fitting parameters of these other terms, but we can generate, a simulation which looks qualitatively similar to what we observe experimentally. So we're just beginning to do more studies to see if we can really indeed get there to have a predictive model. And as I mentioned, I think the hope is that if we have that, we can apply a lot of well-established approaches of model-based control and design and planning to help our robots do better in these kinds of environments. Okay, so next before I go to the next major part, I'll just very quickly go over a couple of more recent projects getting at other aspects. So as the student has already asked, animals are obviously capable of active behaviors such as sensory feedback and reactive planning, etc. So here we're beginning to make measurements of the detailed kinematics of the animal. So we track the head and the body as well as the legs. And our initial result shows that the animal seems to, as they push against these beams before they make the transition, they seem to be bending their head up and down a lot, which we think might be their mechanism, might be a way to sense the force or the resistance, and that gives them some idea of this physical interaction, and they can make use of that. And when they traverse, before they traverse, they spread their legs out to try to push forward, but as they start to make the rolling, they would actually pull their legs closer to their body, maybe to reduce the stability, to help better roll faster. And they also push one leg more and retract another leg, again, maybe to help assist this rolling motion. So we're just, to get a deeper understanding, we're just beginning to create a robot, much like a cockroach, which has these degrees of freedom, ability to bend the head, to move the legs in different ways, to spread them out. And we're using a sensor developed by another group at Hopkins we want to try to add these low-cost sensors to make measurements. Our hope is that, again, as I mentioned, that because the landscape dominates the dynamics, perhaps you can sense the forces to infer the landscape and act upon that to better traverse. So do better than just blindly throwing your legs forward. Yeah, another tool that we have been developing, we are also thinking about how we can understand longer-term locomotor behavior, which might be useful to understand sensory navigation, decision-making, and learning. And in terrestrial locomotion, what people often use is for longer-term observation and really zooming in on the animal is to use a treadmill. But obviously, with a treadmill, you can't do complex terrain like this. So we came up with an idea when we saw this little celestial model. So we designed a complex terrain treadmill. You can put obstacle on a sphere and then have another sphere on the outside attached to it. And we can close the loop with a camera to control the sphere to rotate in opposite direction as the animal to keep it on top. So here is an initial video we have. There's a cockroach on top trying to go through many obstacles. Yeah, and we're just beginning to quantify. Here is showing the probability distribution of the animal position in the field of view. We can very well, at high probability, center the animal at the very top. And then we're just starting to work on the 3D reconstruction of this motion through many obstacles over a long time. Yeah, so finally, in the last 12 minutes or so, I'll quickly go over another major direction that we have started in the lab, which is looking at limbless locomotion through such complex 3D terrain. So snakes, and we pick snakes as our model organism because they're very good at these kind of environment, as you see. And obviously, they have to deform their body in 3 dimensions by a large amount. But when you look at our studies of terrestrial snake locomotion, most of the study have been on relatively flat surfaces with which the out-of-plane deformation of the body is small compared to body size. There's a little bit of body lifting in the side winding gait, but it's still small compared to the body size. And snake has also been a long inspiration for roboticists, starting from Hirose several decades ago. And we have, in terms of traversing large obstacles, we have many snake robots developed to do so. And you can see several examples. There are 3 of them. I think that's the dominant way people do this, is to use the follow the leader gait, in which each segment follows the previous one. And in this case, to overcome a large step, then the robot simply would lift its body up vertically and then back down. So its body deformation occurs in this 2D sagittal plane. And there's this other one from Howard Chosa's group, which is artificially designed gait. But still, before the robot reaches the surface on top, it always tries to keep its center of gravity within that very narrow base of support. So in all these cases, that control of your body so that your center of mass doesn't go out of base support is very important, which is partly why they're mostly quite slow quasi-static motion. Yeah, so we're curious to see what real snakes can do. Here is, we also studied them going through large steps, and we collaborated with Greg Chirek-Jen's group a little bit to apply their backbone interpolation method to reconstruct a continuous 3D body shape of the snake, which allows us to get position and orientation information, as well as the surface if you know the radius. So with this, we can start to quantify the snake's gait. And here is a large step, which is about 1/3 the body length. You can see that the animal would laterally undulate on the horizontal surfaces, and the body section in the middle pitches up, but it's not vertically upward, but actually a little bit forward, but it's mostly straight. And this pattern continuously, fluidly travels down the body as the animal makes the progress. And that motion is called cantilevering, that in the air. Yeah, here's the projected view. Yeah, so now when we compare this with the gaits that people have used for robots, you can see with the follow the leader gait, you have very narrow base of support. So the roll stability, you can imagine, will be very poor if you have lateral perturbation. But for the animal, if you had large lateral oscillation, then it gives you a wide base of support. So we can use our tracked data to calculate that base of support. And we found that over 100% of the time for all of the trials that we have, which are 40 trials with 3 animals, they're 100% stable. There's not a single moment that they are unstable. Yeah, so from this, so my student built a snake robot which can deform its body in 3 dimensions. And we also added these wheels. The purpose of that is for snake locomotion, it turns out that their body friction against a surface is anisotropic because of the scales. When you slide a snake down a slope with the head facing downward, the friction is very low. Whereas if the head is facing upward, the friction is high. That's because the scales are pointing backward. There's also actually large friction if you slide it laterally because of microscopic sawtooth-like structure on the edges of the scales. So we have these wheels that are one-directional, much like a ratchet wrench, with which you can have a rolling friction, small rolling friction forward, but a large backward sliding friction and a large lateral friction to simulate what the animal has. So now we apply our gait to the snake robot, and you can see that with this modest step height, which is about 20% of the body length, it's able to do quite well, quite rapidly. This is in real time, and at high probability of 90%, 9 out of 10 trials. But as we challenge the robot to go over even greater, larger obstacles, you can see it starts to fail more. Here, we only have about half the trials that succeeded. And you can see there are many complex interaction here. The body seems to be losing contact We think that this is due to the stochasticity in the system, both the asperity of the terrain as well as in your control and mechanical fabrication, that it's very hard to maintain perfect contact, perfect symmetry. And as you break that symmetry, it's going to make you roll or more, and that's going to lead to even worse symmetry. So it's very hard to recover. So in fact, so to understand, in fact, this is again a highly stochastic process. There are many different failure modes. There's the roll, which you saw. There's the yaw, which is we try to control the robot to just go straight, perpendicular to the step, but it can sometimes, due to the asymmetry, turn left or right. And then there's this, if you roll too much and cannot recover, you will fall off the step, and then you can also be stuck like this. So we again can look at how the snake is doing statistically, and we found again it's a very complex stochastic transitions, but there's these statistical trends. In particular, if you look at what eventually led to the failure, which are these red arrows from the roll to the failure, which is rolling too much and fall off the step. You can see that as we increase the step height, more and more challenging, it would roll more and more and eventually fall off statistically. So the roll stability decreases with step height. But when we look at real snakes, here is a very low friction surface. You can see they struggle a lot in terms of generating forces. They slip a lot, but they still are able to traverse. And again, when we calculate the stability, it is 100% stable. Yeah, so what might be helping the snake? The body is quite compliant, as you see here, whereas our wheels are rigid. There's only a very small give. So inspired by that, we added car-like suspension to our robot and then tested it again. Here, with everything else the same, you can see that the robot had a higher chance of recovering from such roll instability to eventually traverse. It does take longer time, though. Yeah, and now we can, again, look at these probability transition, and you see, if you look at the red arrows, you can see that it still happens, but greatly suppressed compared to earlier, the rigid robot. Yeah, and when we compare our robot to other robots, here is a plot showing the step height as a function of traversal time. The step height is normalized to the body size of each system. So if you divide the step height by the traversal time, it gives you the traversal speed normalized to body size. So what that means is if you draw a line from origin to each of these different data, that's the slope of that line would give you the normalized speed. So you can see that our snake robot data, which have these two lines for the rigid and compliant, which are identical statistically, they have higher slopes than most of these previous robots, indicating that relative to your body size, you are traversing faster. But it's still falling behind real snakes. And there's one previous robot, the T2 Snake 3 you saw on top, that actually has a high speed, and it actually uses a different gate, the follow the leader gate, but it also uses part of its body to support itself on the vertical surface. And in this case, they use active wheels, which are rotating at high speed, and the forward speed of the robot relative to its body size is on a flat surface is already much greater than our robot. Yeah, so that explains why it's faster. But also, as you would clearly see, it's going to lack roll stability. Yeah, so finally, we also saw some evidence of snake using this similar gate, dividing its body, part of which is used for propulsion and with lateral undulation, and part of which to bridge across surfaces in different types of terrain. Especially for this rubble-like terrain, we think that our current robot is not going to do well at all, because it's hard to imagine you can control your wheels to always maintain good contact with such broken surfaces. So we're just beginning to develop a next version of the robot with distributed body compliance with a soft outer shell using a scale design that's developed by another group. Yeah, and you can see it's already working reasonably well on a flat surface. Yeah, so our longer-term vision is that through these fundamental research, we can begin to add the physics to the well-established approach of robot locomotion, to enable our robots not just to avoid obstacles through environmental geometry, but to traverse them with probabilistic locomotor transitions. Yeah, with that, I would like to thank all my group members, particularly these 5 students here who did the majority of the work that I showed today. Also my advisors, Dan Goldman, Bob Fo, and Ron Fearing, who have led me into this fascinating field and guided me over the years. And many colleagues who have been very supportive and have always been willing to give me very helpful advice, especially Dan here. Thank you very much. And of course, our funding sources. And thank you all for your attention. And I'll take questions.
Question on the analogy between the protein folding
Yes.
case and the rolling pitch transition.
Okay.
So thermal fluctuation, I would imagine it more like a noise thing instead of sinusoidal thing. So would you like so have you considered using different noise profiles?
Yes.
To see
Yes.
how the
Yes, yeah, great question. So we haven't done that for this particular transition. As I mentioned, we did have other projects. I can show one real quick. So here is one other model system or model phenomena that we've been looking at, which is the cockroach riding themselves. As they go through such terrain, they sometimes flip over. So that got me interested when I was a postdoc into this problem. And you can clearly see that here. Oops. You can see that here it's this transition from being upside down to upright. And there are, again, many ways you can do it, such as doing a full somersault along the blue trajectory, or you can start doing that. But what the animal often does is very quickly rolls to one side or the other. So there's also this interesting probabilistic distribution. And if you look more closely, the animal would have, as it opens, there's 2 wings to push because its head kind of sticks out. That forms this triangular support, which if you don't have enough kinetic energy, you're going to be stuck in that local potential energy minima. But you see that the animal flails its legs around a lot. So we first did a study that's equivalent to what I showed. We used a robot, and in real animal, we added weights to their feet to change that kinetic energy available. But more recently, my student had a great idea, basically addressing what you just asked, whether that randomness can also help. I don't have slides here in this, this was done in simulation because we can't really control the animal. So in simulation, we validated the dynamics simulation, and then we injected noise at different places. Basically, we changed the phase randomly between the leg oscillation of the leg and the wings, and we find that as the more noise, the better it is to make its way out of this local minima. And as we look further, it turns out that if you have a strictly periodic motion, then if you just happen to start with initial condition, or your system happen to have a design you start with some phase, then you are stuck in that kind of like a limit cycle. But with that noise, it changes the phase. It helps you actually explore the parameter space randomly, kind of like a random search that can help you leap out. We think that for other systems such as these beam traversal, very likely that can also help the animal. Yeah. Yes?
What is your hypothesis on how the compliance of these snake robot succeed more on the transfer to the higher ground?
Oh, yeah. So I didn't get to talk about that. We did very much like we did with our cockroach direction. We also tracked in 3D in high precision the position of the robot and relative to the surface, and we can then calculate its distance of its wheels to the surface. What we found is that when you are completely rigid, as the step becomes higher, because of all these small noise, the system will start to wobble, and the wheels lose contact more and more relative to the surface. But when we add the compliance, both wheels, they have their independent spring. So if I roll a little bit left, this one is going to compress more. That helps me maintain contact with the other or at least at a higher probability. So that seems to be what's happening here. Yeah, Mark?
Following along the lines of the same
Okay.
project, the control, so there's two things. One thing is with some lateral undulations, I think Hirose had a paper, and I actually some work as well on, with lateral undulation, it's not flat. It's actually a little bit of bottom lifting.
I see, yeah.
The body, where forces are applied.
Yes. That's for a flat surface locomotion, right? Yeah. That in like animal locomotion, people have known this. I think it's called sinus lifting. That the animal will lift parts of its body to distribute its weights so that it's not homogeneous, and it distributes such that the parts of the body that generates propulsive force gets more weight. Yeah, gets more higher pressure. Yes.
So, and I'm thinking that during the climbing portion, some type of closed loop force control was the same.
Yes.
Was it the control that you applied? Was that also looking at forces and distributing forces?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. So in this case, I didn't get to explain. So how we control the robot, we pre-design this gate. We tell the robot if you are not close to the step, to that vertical surface, then you follow some pre-designed undulatory wave, which are the same for the top and the bottom. They connect together. If you look from the top, it just looks like a wave. But when you are close, then we have a camera that tracks the position of the robot relative to the step. We also use that camera to determine the step height. So we basically, it's a very simple thresholding. If you are close enough, you pitch up. If you, right now it's just that. But that's exactly what we're getting towards over our next step. We're trying to learn how to do compliant control. So not just mechanical design compliance, but actually a compliance in your control. If you feel that, I think very likely the real snakes are doing that. Because they only see like their front. I mean, they might see a little bit, but their body is very likely, like especially with the rubble-like terrain, their body is very likely in real time sensing its interaction and modulating the body movement. So
the snake in the actual animal in that data, does the snake actually do what you did, which is follow the curve and the top was connected, or does it do something different?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't looked at carefully enough for me to say if it is or not. For the robot, we just picked that up for simplicity. Yeah.
I think it's better than not.
Yeah, it's very likely. Especially if the low friction surface. In fact, if you look more closely, the body does not have this continuous wave. It's kind of intermittent. It's not exactly like start stop, but it does slow down and then speed up a bit. Again, possibly modulated by their sensory feedback. They try to not maybe oscillate too vigorously to slip too much. Yeah.
In the interest of time, I'll save my questions for another day. Wonderful.
Thank you all.